Good evening. Good to have each of you here tonight, and hope you're having a good week. And we always appreciate the blessing of God sending rain, especially this time of year, so that's a real blessing. I wanted to mention something for those who are listening in, and if you want to make a note of this, that you can. Barry's going to lead us in the kingdoms of earth, and we'll put it up. But the ones that we listened to was done by a man by the name of Michael Eldridge, and he sings all four parts, and started doing that several years ago, and came from a singing family. And The Kingdoms of Earth Pass Away is from a CD entitled What is Noble, but get ready for this. This is the professional name I'm going to spell. A-C-A-P Eldridge. So it's like a cappella, but his last name is Eldridge. So it's A-C-A-P E-L-D-R-I-D-G-E. He blended together a cappella Ridge. And if you ever want to listen to it, he's got a whole set of songs that you can listen to. But just this note before Barry leads us in the song. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. You read through the rest of the first chapter, and the very last verse then simply says, "And Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus." So translation, Nebuchadnezzar, the first and the great king, none of the rest of the Babylonian kings even came close, and the kingdom was in a slow, kind of long decline, and the Medes and the Persians, the Chaldeans are in that, depending upon how you interpret what their name is. They rose up, and then Daniel, when we come to chapter 6, is going to be thrown into the lion's den under the Persians. So he's going to actually rise to the top of two different kingdoms. And this vision that he's going to interpret for King Nebuchadnezzar, where we'll go through and we'll save that toward the end of class for all those different things. And you are the head of gold. But the physical kingdoms rise and fall even during his life. And this song, I think, is an important reminder that regardless of what earthly kingdom we're a part of, that we as the sons and daughters of God are part of a spiritual kingdom which will never be shaken or never fall.
I'm still learning this myself, so we'll take the first verse a little slower, and then we'll bring it up to tempo as we get into the second and third verses.
The kingdoms of earth pass away one by one, but the kingdom of heaven remains. It is built on a rock, and the Lord is its king, and forever and ever he reigns. It shall stand, it shall stand forever
And again, if you're visiting us tonight, outlines are on the communion table, and you're always welcome to pick one up. In the book of Peter, we have this fabulous description that the prophets and the people who were old were intently looking to see at what manner of a time that these things would take place and they would happen. And the two major things that off and on we've touched on that have such a major application at this particular point in Daniel is, and we're going to see specifically tonight, God is going to change his name from Abram to Abraham. And he says, and you will become the father of many nations. And that's just such an amazing promise. But the part probably that impacts you and I the most is, through you I will bless all nations. And remember, Abraham is as far before the cross as we are after the cross. And so 4,000 years ago, God calls this wonderful man and says, let's count the stars tonight. And if you can count the stars, you can count your children. And this is one growing up on the edge of the Dust Bowl. Well, Abraham, if you can count the dust of the earth, you can count your children. And these images, both at his feet and as high as the eye can see, are these promises that God makes to Abraham. 1,000 years later, David in 2 Samuel 7 decides he wants to build the temple. He wants to build, his term was, a house for the Lord. And God sends the prophet and says, no, you have shed too much blood. You will not build a house. I will make of you a house, and one of your descendants will reign on the throne forever. By the time we come to the first captives in 606, so that was 1,000, then in 606, 605, when the captives go into captivity, Jehoiakim is going to be the last king. And 600 years later, I'm very empathetic with why they're asking, are you the king? And do you remember in John 6 when they feed the 5,000, Jesus has divided them up? And I don't know if he told them or if the apostles did this, and this one's in Mark. He puts them in groups of 50s and 100s. Who are in groups of 50s and 100s? Military people. We're getting everything organized. We're going to finally overthrow the Romans. We're going to take this place over again. And John says, seeing they came to make him a king by force, then Jesus dismisses them. And it's very interesting. The expression is, Jesus made them get in the boat. And one of my New Testament teachers says, he says, I have this image of kind of 1 foot on the shore and 1 foot on the boat and grabbing guys by the back of the neck and chunking them in the boat. Because they're so excited. They've been out preaching about seeds, about the parables and the kingdom and all this happened, and they've got 5,000 men, and we've got a guy who can feed people and don't have to worry about supply lines. And they're thinking this is going to be the fulfillment of this promise to David. To my mind, that's why the single conversation of the apostles for the ministry of Jesus that's repeated more than anything else is what? Either who's going to be the greatest or who's going to sit on the right hand and the left hand. And they're not thinking heaven. And so when you look at Daniel and the people who would have read Daniel for the first time, you have all of these promises that have been going on for all of this period of time. How do we reconcile the fact of being in captivity with all these promises? And God has told the prophets, especially Jeremiah and a bit with Ezekiel, and the image is very much like the same way the people were sent into Egypt back in the time of Jacob. I am going to bring someone from the north, and I will bring these people back, at a point in time, and they will eventually return, and we'll see Daniel talk more about that later. But we're going to look at something very specific tonight, and it's just the challenge of Daniel and his three friends starting a new life in Babylon. And as we mentioned, we don't have any indication specifically of the date. In my mind, a ballpark of 15. Because, and someone help me with this, if you subtract 536 from 606, what do you get? Okay, how many? Okay, he's in captivity for 70 years. If he's 15, he's 85 when he gets thrown in the lion's den. Do you see the boundaries of what we're talking about? And so I don't think he's 20 or 25. I think he's maybe late, mid-teenager when he and his friends get carried away into captivity, because we can account for this 70-year period of time, and then we have to push back before that. So that's what we've said previous. And I'm sorry, I'm not being disrespectful, but I do remember the flannel visual aids in my Bible classes in Sayre, and he looked like a young man when he goes in the lion's den. That was just my visual image from godly teachers teaching us in Bible class. It's a whole different thing to throw a 20-year-old and an 85-year-old man in a lion's den. And that also is this wonderful window that we're going to have in terms of his faithfulness through the decades and all these different situations. So I've just entitled our lesson tonight, Starting a New Life in Babylon. Central idea. The Hebrew exiles, captives, whatever you want to call them, were challenged with, and I'm going to term it this way, spiritual, and it's going to be cultural, it's going to be physical, political, but especially spiritual assimilation into Babylonian culture. And I want us to notice how the exiles maintained their spiritual convictions in Babylon. So through these first 6 chapters, and each chapter is kind of a panel of just a glimpse of what took place, you'll see it's in chapter 1 and verse 3. Bill, I didn't bring my water tonight. Could I bother you to get me some water? I apologize. I didn't think I would need it. So here's chapter 1 and verse 3. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring, and here's some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and the nobility. And this becomes very important because we had talked last week about gods were very regional in the ancient world, and people always assumed that when one country conquered another, that their god had triumphed over the god of this other people. And so in the same way, it's a different context, but it's very parallel as we looked earlier. In the same way that Joseph is the preferred chosen son, he's lived a life of favor and goodwill and acceptance as Jacob's favorite son before he sold into Egypt. Then we get a glimpse, Daniel and his 3 friends, before Jerusalem fell, were of the royal family and nobility. It's a big step down from nobility to being a captive. I'm assuming most of these guys probably hiked the hundreds of miles from Jerusalem to Babylon. I doubt that they provided beast of burden for them to ride on. And you just think of all the humiliation and the laughter, and here your city has been conquered and destroyed, and we'll talk about just the magnificence of this huge, huge city of Babylon. And thank you, sir. And just imagine having been of nobility, royal family, and physically you survive this tedious journey and you come to this absolutely magnificent city that of all things the Euphrates River runs through. And the contrast between your conquered city and the city of the conquerors would have just have been vast. We'll touch on 1:4 again, but These are, I'm not critical when I read these, but let's just notice what the text says. They are youths without blemish. They are of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom. And we're going to come back later and just talk about wisdom both in a biblical sense and in this sense. Endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. A writer from a much earlier generation said, and this was kind of tacky, but he said, the king doesn't want either smart people who don't look very well or people who are good looking and who are dumb. That's kind of the outward criteria. And you look at what the text says. We're looking for some good looking guys, but they have to be really sharp. And I'm going to use the term as we go through class. The ones who are selected are going to be enrolled into a 3-year advanced university course. And that's going to be a challenge within itself. So here are the characteristics: youths without blemish, good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, competent to stand in the king's palace. Sometimes people who are gifted in one area of life can so depend upon that one area that they don't develop into others. I'm thinking of some guys that I knew that were really good in sports, and they just always assumed that would always kind of carry them through, and they didn't have to really worry about it because they were really good at that one thing. Ladies, don't stone me. I'm not trying to be tacky, but we have all seen some ladies, not any here necessarily, not necessarily not any here, period, who have primarily relied on outward appearance, and that's been the main part of their life. During the Dust Bowl and being 10 miles out in the country, my grandmother was the midwife for 2 decades of children born in the New Liberty community. And no hospital, and only if they got in a crisis would you run someone into town. And so she was the midwife for this whole group of people. And one of the things that I learned from my grandmother, she said, "Son, be very careful when you're picking a life partner, because some girls are as pretty as models, but they have the maternal instincts of a mannequin." I won't repeat that, but what was she saying? There are some people who have so focused on the outside that there's not a whole lot there on the inside. And what the king is looking for is both. We want guys who are of good appearance, without blemish, but then we also want these things: skillful in wisdom. And like I said, I'm probably going to do a whole paragraph on this later. But well, let me say it this way. And again, not trying to be tacky in saying this. We have all met people who are so smart that they can't come out of the rain. I'm talking about just IQ. I mean, just absolute IQ. My son works in the IT department at Oklahoma Christian. I said, "Matey, why are you in this office and not out here?" And he said, "Dad," he said, and he went through the list. These guys can do this and this and this and this. But he said the one biggest problem they have is telling other people what they know. And he said, "I'm the one person who's kind of the interpreter for the whole group. I'm not as smart as anyone in here on any one thing, but I'm the one guy that can kind of understand what's," and you need somebody who's not just so smart that they don't have that capacity. Wisdom is the ability to assess a certain situation and do and say the right thing at the right time. How many of us have daughter-in-laws? Okay, Bill, you're going to be a good target on this one. there are some things that I can say to my son that I shouldn't say to my daughter-in-law. And I'm not picking on her. I'm just talking about timing. I'm talking about perspective. And the same way, the other way. And we have a close friend who they raised 4 boys. And she said, I was really good on the guy thing until they started bringing these girls around. And it was like, okay, yes, I am one, but here I've been in a household with these 5 guys. That's what I've known for 2 decades. And then all of a sudden we start bringing in, and these girls are as different as my guy. And so she said, our get-togethers became much more complicated in a hurry than I had anticipated, because I was doing pretty good with just 4 guys. You guys understand what I'm talking about there? And it's not a matter of being inappropriate, but it's just saying, see, that's what wisdom is. And here's the 2 things that I both pray about and struggle with, and I'll just leave this on me. Sometimes something has happened and I should have said something and I didn't. And then later I think, okay, Lord, help me. If this comes up again, if we rewind, help me to have both the tact and the courage to say something. Other times, you may know what I'm about to say, I said something and I shouldn't have. Maybe not right then. This is going to sound a little bit trivial, but I've learned this the hard way. If I need to go to talk with someone about something that's happened in the church, and you fill in the blank, I don't care what it is, this is just me. I don't want to talk. I want to talk about that one thing, and I want to pray and leave. I don't want to say, and Wayne, and also, and in addition, if there's something that is really significant that we need to talk about spiritually, I've learned the hard way, at least for me, if I need to have that heart-to-heart talk with a brother and or a sister, wisdom has taught me the hard way, let's don't talk about B, C, and D tonight. Let's just talk about this one thing. Let's pray about that and leave. And I've learned that the hard way. And so this wisdom thing is that they're not only just good-looking and they're not eggheads. I don't like my terms, but I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say. But they're also guys who have a sense of timing, have a sense of, again, being able to say the right thing at the right time. And sometimes how we say something may be more important than what we say. So, looking around, I think we have some families that have all boys. Guess what? You get to anticipate, Lord willing, at some time, and just been. But again, it multiplies in a lot of different ways. But look at kind of the unique type of people that they're looking for, and then the text says to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. There's 2 parts of this. Aramaic is kind of the universal lingua franca, the common speech, like English is. And Aramaic wouldn't have been that difficult, and they may have known some others. But there's also a language called Akkadian that is very, very complicated. They would have read all kinds of myths, the discussions of Gilgamesh about creation, and it's interesting that there are both creation stories and boat flood stories in every ancient culture. I mentioned recently our brothers, probably in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, that went into Indian tribes into upper Guatemala, way, way, way up. And in listening to them, they said, like our letter D and our letter K, you had the same letter in 3 different words, but it depended upon where you put your tongue, either on the back or the middle or the roof of your mouth, for how it came out. Oh, I mean to have 2 kind of English consonants that depending, and see, I can't even hardly do my tongue like that, and so learning to speak to be able to be understood was such a major, major challenge. And that's why they studied the Gospel of Mark. because anyone that could read any parts of it would say the same thing in their language that it did in their native language. But these guys are going to become linguists, and they're going to be exposed to a wide range of different stories, theologies, and other things about different gods. And Lord willing, if I don't go too long, we'll talk more about that at the end. 1:5, the king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. And Lord willing, we'll talk about this next week. The decision not to become unclean probably had a lot to do with much of this food may have been offered to different gods, different festivals, different things. And if you joined in eating the king's food, you've joined into the celebration of their gods and these other things. And at this point, next week's lesson is entitled Pop Quizzes and Final Exams. Wonderful expression from Everett Hufford, who's taught for decades. And he said, you know, as we go through life as human beings, at different times, God will give us a pop quiz. Maybe a temptation, something needs to be done. And then every so often in life, we get a major exam. And he said, God's patient with us. Sometimes when we fail one of those, given a little bit of time, he'll give us another opportunity to, well, let me say it this way. There's no such thing as a little temptation, and there's no such thing as this really isn't that important. And I'm talking about decisions where we're at a crossroads. Some of those are bigger decisions than others. And what we're going to find is that these guys consistently get A's on the pop quizzes. And therefore, like, for example, when we're going to be thrown into a fiery furnace, when we get thrown in the lion's den, major exams, they've been up to scratch already, and they've been making good decisions along the way. And then Daniel tells us in 1:5, they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. I am not real strong in languages, and when we were in Memphis, I got to take advanced readings in Greek 3 times. I was the teacher's pet, so I had to go back and be with him 3 times. But what Carol Osmond referred to do was for you to come in, and his Greek New Testament would flop open, and you would sight read the first 10 verses on the right-hand page 5 times. And it might flop open in Revelation or whatever. And we had a guy who took the class 6 times and was under hypnosis and counseling and still didn't pass. So we had 3-hour classes, and I learned to wear blue jeans and basketball socks because I would start on the outside with the sweat on my hands and wipe all the way down on the outside and then get my socks wet on the outside and then start on the inside. If you're in 3 hours and it's just you and your Greek New Testament, and said, Wayne, would you translate this verse for us? All you have is your Greek New Testament. No help at all. Mr. Hartman, read this verse in 1 John. Jesus came to loose the works of the devil. And luo was the most frequent word that we had, luo, over and over and again. And the whole class starts laughing. So I start wiping. I learned not to wear these pants. I looked like I'd had an accident in 3 hours, so I wore blue jeans. And so I'm wiping the sweat off, and he said, Mr. Hartman, let's try that again. Jesus came to loose the works of the devil. And then he said, class, there's another meaning for this word. Can someone help Mr. Hartman out? And the word is destroy. Okay, that sounds a little better. But I couldn't think of destroy if my life depended upon it. So when I see these 3 guys going to stand before the king before this final exam, then, Wayne, I'd need to wear blue jeans and my basketball socks because I would just be sweating profusely getting ready for that. And that's what they were going to be in line to do. Now, many of you know this, but we'll come through this in different ways and we'll speed up from here. When we have a Hebrew name with E-L in the word, it's some derivative of God. So here's our Hebrew names. Daniel, God, El, is my judge. Hananiah, Yahweh, burning bush. I made myself known to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, the God who's strong, the God above the mountain. I did not reveal myself as Yahweh. So Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, Yahweh has helped. And this is significant, is that each of these four guys, their Hebrew name has something to do with who they're later going to start referring to as the God of heaven, being surrounded with all these gods in Babylon. So verse 7 says, the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. They're going to change their names. Daniel is Belshazzar. May Bel protect his life. And Bel is another name for Marduk, who is their chief god. Shadrach, the command of Aku, who's a Sumerian and Elamite moon god. Meshach, who is like, or what is Aku is, the god. And then Abednego, servant of the god, and it's either Nego, and some wonder if it's Nebo. But all four guys end up with a name that has something to do with the gods of Babylon. So we don't know all the details about their new names, but the Hebrew captives are given new names to develop a new identity with the local gods in the land of their captors. Their Babylonian names were part of the effort to erase their Hebrew ties with Yahweh in their homeland, and the renaming of these young men was an open attack on their heritage and faith. The new names were also a spoken declaration of the domination of the Babylonian gods over the defeated God of the Hebrew nation. So these will be very quick. El 2:1, again, the Semitic, the regional name for God. And it's very interesting, when the clay tablets were discovered of the Baal library, I think 1947, 1948, El was the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. But he had kind of been overshadowed by the rise of Baal, and Baal was master and Lord. But even the Canaanites referred to kind of the father god as El, which was a name that's often given to the God of Israel. So look at these names under 2:2. El Bethel, the God of Bethel. El Shaddai, the God who's strong. That's what the patriarchs knew him. And then look at this through Genesis. You'll see El Shaddai used over and over by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But El Shaddai is the God who's strong, the God who is mighty. When I read Job, our Old Testament theology teacher said, when I read Job, in my mind, I have him as a Bedouin in Arabia. And you get to looking, there's nothing about Abraham, there's nothing about promise, there's nothing about Israel, there's nothing about Jerusalem, the people of God. And he said, I think he was outside the seed promise of the line of Abraham, but he was obviously someone who's deeply involved with God. And guess what he refers to him as? The Almighty. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. God says, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? And then I would never have noticed this, but just looking, as our New Testament closes, God is oftentimes referred to as the Almighty in the book of Revelation. There's a number of references. So here's some samples. There's many. But notice El, Bethel, house of God. Eliezer, God is helper. Samuel, Hannah's prayed for him, asked of God, heard of God. Elijah, my God is Yahweh. Elisha, God is Savior. Joel, Yahweh is God. And then here are two contemporaries, Ezekiel, God is strong, and Daniel, God is judge. Since we were talking about names, I thought I'd just include these. I don't know if the word nickname may be too casual, but there's two occasions especially where God gave, can I use the word pet names, nicknames, you know what I'm saying? God is going to refer to Israel as Jeshurun. And I'll leave you to look at these, but Jeshurun is kind of God's pet name for Israel. And Psalm's going to say, there is none like God, O Jeshurun. And remember, Baal is described in the Baal mythology as the one who is the god of the air. He rides the clouds. Baal is the god of thunder and lightning and rain in the springtime. And we'll hear echoes of the Lord. Jeshurun, our God, rides through the heavens to help you through the skies of his majesty. Isaiah, the Lord who made you and formed you will help you. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, Jeshurun, whom I have chosen. Of all things, and I just shudder when I read this, David's second child, the first child committed with adultery with Bathsheba, David names Solomon, and what does God name him? Jedediah. I have a dear, dear friend, very spiritually minded, one of the Sykes family, and I'm sorry, okay? He named his son Jedediah, and the only thing I could think of was the Beverly Hillbillies, the Clampetts. I'm confessing my biblical ignorance here. And when I finally got told, I said, I have a question. I said, why? And I wasn't going to admit my ignorance, but I just kind of opened it. I said, why would you name your son? And they were going to call him Jed. And the song runs in my head, and the old dilapidated, all this stuff. That's all I could think of was why on earth would someone so spiritually minded name their son Jed? And he said, oh, have you noticed the name that God gave to Solomon? I said, no. He said, go look it up. So Jeshurun is God's pet name, nickname for Israel, and Jedediah was this special name that God gave to Solomon. If this isn't God's grace, I don't know what is. Bathsheba bore a son, and David called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him. Isn't that amazing? And where is the temple built? The threshing floor of Aruna that David bought after the census, and he had committed a sin. And who is the man that God leaves to build the temple on the threshing floor that David bought? It's Jedediah, Solomon. And I just read this and just kind of shake down the shivers about the grace of God, that the whole construction of that original temple is a testimony to God overcoming even human weaknesses. So when God changes someone's name, and you can read these carefully, I am God Almighty. See, there it is, El Shaddai. That's who the patriarchs knew him as. And your name was Abram, but I am going to change your name to Abraham, the father of many nations. Your name is Jacob. He's wrestled with the angel all night. And he's going to change his name to Israel. And Israel means he who strives and he who wrestles with God. And virtually every time I read the story in Genesis, I think, isn't that descriptive of what's going to happen for the next 1,000 years? The nation of Israel is going to wrestle and strive with God, and God changes his name. Simon, son of Barjona, is a pebble. Peter is a foundation, a big rock. Joseph, and I apologize, Kristen caught this and I didn't get back and change it. We're going to go from Joseph to Barnabas. Saul, we've talked about, asked, prayed for. Paul, little, diminutive. And finally, in Acts 13:4, Saul, who was also called Paul. I'll leave you to look at number 3, and I don't mean this to be disrespectful, but toward the bottom, I'll just mention, I grew up occasionally hearing lessons that said the apostles were ignorant and unlearned men, and it was kind of like the more ignoranter we are, the more godlier we are because we're more like the apostles. I'm not quite sure that's what the text is saying. And all I want you to notice, Moses is trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and we're going to come back to this in a second. Isaiah is the prophet to the royal family, to the kings. He is in and out of the kingdom, first of Israel and then of Judah. Ezra is a scribe skilled in the law of Moses. He set his heart to study. Daniel is going to be educated in all the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Our beloved Luke, Lord willing, we're going to look at this summer, that Paul calls the beloved physician. Insomuch as many have undertaken to write an account of the things that have happened among us, it seemed good to me, most excellent Theophilus, to write to you an orderly account of the things that have happened, having talked to the eyewitnesses and the ministers of the word, so that you may have a sense of confidence in the things that you've been taught. And the language of the New Testament, while it is in koine, is closer to the language of medical textbooks and technical books than anything else in the first century. And God's going to choose Dr. Luke to write first the gospel and then this wonderful story in the book of Acts. Paul, and we talked about this when we did the statue of Gamaliel earlier. During the life of Jesus, the bright minds were Hillel and Shammai, and then Gamaliel comes along from the 30s to 66, and then we're going to have Yohanan ben Zakkai in the 70s when the temple's destroyed. But a Hebrew scholar said, he said, I think the brightest Jewish mind in the first century was Gamaliel. And again, the old typewriter, I'm going, ding, oh, what does Paul say? I sat at the feet of Gamaliel. I was raised in this city. Yes, he's born in early years in Tarsus, but here he is in Jerusalem. Gamaliel, God is my reward, God is my recompense. So just looking at the New Testament, Luke, Dr. Luke is going to write 27% of our New Testament. Paul is going to write 23%, and these two guys are going to be a huge chunk of that. And all I'm saying is that God chose to take the skills they had learned in their academic pursuits and apply them to spiritual things. So here's how we're going to close. Daniel and his friends are the first generation of Hebrews to live outside of Canaan for over 1,000 years. So we're going back to Joshua coming in and conquering the east side, crossing over, and as God promised Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, I'm going to give you descendants. They are in the land of Canaan for 1,000 years, and how ironic, Ezekiel, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are more faithful to God hundreds and hundreds of miles away in Babylon than their countrymen had been while they were living in the promised land. And that's still just what a challenge. But this is important. Their primary identity was not their status in society. It wasn't their intelligence or the university degree in language and culture. Their identity was their relationship with God. Let me say a couple of things and let you go. We started reading to our children literally the day they came home from the hospital. We started reading Jesus, the friend of children. And I told them, I said, I want you to be really, really good students. And when we'd have parent and teacher, especially with our son, the first question was, is my son respectful to you as a teacher? I want to know how his behavior is. I'm not worried about his grade. Is my son respectful to you as a student, as a teacher? But I told our kids, I said, I want you to do the best you can in school because you could become a national merit finalist, but if you lose your soul, what have you gained? You could have a 4-point average, and if you lose your faith in God, what have you gained? And I said, I want you to be good students so that you can be lifetime students of the Bible. And like the guys we're going to read about, Moses and Daniel, then they're going to use their learning academically to apply very specifically to spiritual things. So here's the last two things. I'm on 2:1 at the bottom. Moses writes the first 5 books of the Old Testament, trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Daniel is going to write the vision of what's going to take place for 600 years leading to the end of the Old Testament, trained in all the wisdom of the Babylonians. And they were good-looking guys. They were bright, but they didn't put their trust either in the external parts of their looks or just in their intelligence and their grades. Their identity was their relationship with God. So as we talk to our children/grandchildren, love the Lord your God with all of your heart. Let's do heart here. I do soul here. That's where we breathe. That's just a part of the divine part of us. With our mind, and then with our strength. And these guys are tremendous examples of that. So isn't it amazing? Carried away as mid-teenagers, live all of their lives in a foreign land, know all about the idolatry and the myths and the stories of Babylon, rise to the top of two empires, but the single most important part of their lives was their identity with God. And may that be ours in generations to come. God bless.